Everybody, welcome back to Addiction, Alcoholism, and the Three Principles. My name is gregsuchy, and I'm here again with Harry Durbitsky, and today we are joined by Angus and Rohini Ross, who I'm pretty excited to have on. We haven't had them on yet for a good conversation here, so this would be exciting. And I know Harry has a little intro he'd like to do, and I'll go ahead and hand it over to Harry before we get started.
Okay, the talk is relationships in relationship to addiction, but really three principles and relationship. And one of the things that I look for in guests are who's sharing something fresh and new from the original thought, not just they took a training and then they're copying the same words and so on. And the Rohinis have not the Rohinis, the Rosses have definitely.
I quite like that, Harry. Let's stay with that.
We're going to make the flying Rohinis.
They have definitely shared a tremendous amount, and they have found something that Greg and I have found. If you share, you grow. And Rohini and Angus, we've been. Greg and I have been very, very impressed with the growth that happens by sharing in new and unusual situations. And so I highly recommend that you take up with some of their stuff. It's very beautiful. And in their relationship talk, I showed it to my daughter, and she loved it. It was just a little 8-minute excerpt, but she absolutely loved it. And in relationships, sharing is obviously a big point. And just to sort of put a different flavor to it, Angus and Rohini are doing some project work at Broadview Recovery Center in Malibu. Angus is doing direct work with the people, and here's something very special. Rohini is working with the executive director, working with the organization. And in dealing with success, which 3P is obviously interested in recovery, you must not just be good with the recovery part of the process of 3P. You have to also take care of the business part. Because if the business part isn't there, the project can't grow organically. So I'm quite pleased with that aspect of it. And so I like what they're sharing. I like their originality, and I like their humanness. You know, they're really sharing without pretense. They're not sugarcoating everything. And with lack of sugarcoating, I'm going to pass it over to the Rosses. Just talk whatever you feel like.
Thank you. I like that. Lack of sugarcoating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for having us. And we're really looking forward to this conversation. And we're open to whatever questions that come forward. We understand this is a real conversation with participation. So we're very open to that. And you know, we decided, can I kick us off?
Yeah, sure.
So one of the things that I think is really key is that in terms of the topic is relationship and addiction, but ultimately relationships are always going to benefit from having that deeper connection and deeper understanding of who we are. And why Angus and I really share a lot about the area of relationships is how profoundly impacted our relationship has been from the understanding shared by Sydney Banks. And we weren't expecting that. When I was the first one to sort of start the exploration with the principles, and I wouldn't have been saying that I was doing it on any level to improve my relationship at that point in time. It was, you know, in my mind, good enough. I wouldn't have said it was amazing, and I certainly didn't know what was available in terms of intimacy, in terms of connection, in terms of openness. But it was through really having a deeper connection inside of myself with a feeling of knowing that I'm okay. My own safety and security lies within me. It's not outside of me, and it can't be taken away from me. That was really what created a profound shift in our relationship dynamic. And, you know, at the time, I didn't really understand what had changed. I just knew that when Angus would get upset or, maybe he was angry, that I would have a different internal experience where I didn't behave in the way that I had previously, where I would get really critical, where I would, shame him for how he was behaving. It was a very different internal experience. And sort of reflecting back and looking at it now, I see what happened was I just stopped being scared. And when I was scared, I would behave in those ways to try and take care of myself that were ultimately very detrimental to the goodwill and the rapport and the love in our relationship. But it was the best that I could do at the time to try and not lose my bearings. I mean, basically, I'd lost my bearings, and that was my best attempt to get my bearings back. But what happened was through one, I think having a better understanding of where experience comes from, which I think is really beautiful, how Sydney Banks points to the simplicity in his teachings of how we create our experience, that it comes from the inside out. I just stopped being as scared by my emotional feelings, like all of the feelings that I would have, whether it was fear, whether it was anxiety, whether it was insecurity, previous to that had been really upsetting, had been scary, had been things that I wanted to control or manage or change. And I thought that they meant something about me. I thought they meant that I needed to improve, that they were a reflection of me not being good enough. And by simply being able to see them more neutrally, it was so empowering. There was so much more room inside of me to just be myself, because I wasn't spending all my energy trying to fix myself or change myself, because I felt okay. And it was that okayness that carried through into the relationship. And then when I look back and sort of look beyond that, what I see is that when I stopped being afraid of my experience so much, I stopped looking at it in the way that I had been fixated on it and obsessing about it and trying to prove it. And what that did is it allowed me to look beyond my emotions and my thoughts. It allowed me to look beyond that to more of who I am in the fullness of that, that I'm not limited, and none of us are limited to just our feelings and our thoughts, that we are far greater than the sum of those. But I didn't realize that because I'd been spending so much time focusing on trying to control my experience, trying to control my thoughts. And even when I first came across the understanding, that was kind of where I initially went with it, was to look at, if my feelings are coming from thoughts, then I just need to figure out how to only have good thoughts, and then I'll only have good feelings all the time. And again, it was really just
How'd that work out for you?
not good. It's exhausting. It's exhausting. But kind of through the exhaustion and finally surrendering of that, it helped me realize that what the understanding points to is something very different than that. It's a description of where experience comes from, but it's not telling me or anyone to do anything with that experience. But in the understanding of it, it becomes so much more manageable. And, I still have all kinds of feelings, but I'm much better able to let them move through me. And I also don't obsess on them in the way that I used to, and can look away. And in looking away, Sydney Banks will talk about a feeling. We're looking for a feeling. And I think I got a little confused by that at first, because I thought it meant I was looking for a good feeling in the sense of a good emotional experience. But how I hear that now is that there's a feeling that we all kind of experience when we look away from our personal thinking and our personal feelings to more of the spiritual nature of who we are, or the impersonal nature of who we are. There's a feeling that goes along with that. That's not a kind of feeling that comes and goes, even though we don't necessarily feel it all the time. But that's sort of the compass point of helping me to kind of see, what direction am I looking in? Am I going deeper into the rabbit hole of the turmoil, or am I looking away from it? And the beautiful thing was that in learning that and seeing that for myself, I just got an internal stability that I had never experienced before in my life. And with that stability, it helped me show up in our relationship in a much more settled and mature way, in a way that was much less reactive, much less judgmental. I was very judgmental of Angus in the past. I can still be a little judgmental. I'm not perfect, but I was very judgmental. And it was because I misunderstood. I thought that he was capable of taking away my feeling of okayness. I thought that his behavior was responsible for my fear, for my insecurity. And when I understood that's not on him, he can't do that. He can't take that away from me. And it doesn't mean that he doesn't, he can't behave badly. He can behave badly, just as I can behave badly at times. But that his behavior isn't what's responsible from taking away that internal experience of okayness. And that allowed me to live life on a whole different foundation. And the beautiful thing is that it impacts every area of life, but it really impacted how we got along with each other. And in that new sort of space where we could just both be ourselves, where he didn't need to be different, I really felt for many years that he needed to be different in order for me to be happier, where he could just be himself with, all of his strengths, all of his weaknesses, where there was no need for him to improve himself and there was no need for me to improve myself. And that actually we could connect more deeply in our humanness. We could connect more honestly from that place, because there was greater resilience, there was greater bounce back for each of us. And I would have thought that I was just, terminally overly sensitive and always going to take things personally and very likely to get my feelings hurt. And recognizing that that's coming from within, that that's not coming from without, that that's just habitual thinking that I get caught up in, was what really allowed that shift inside of me to recognize that he wasn't causing any of that. And that when I saw where it was coming from, I had more choice available to me. I'm not saying I always have choice, but I had more choice available to me in terms of what direction I was going to look in. And fundamentally, we all have that available to us when we see that there is a choice available to us, and that when we recognize it, we're naturally going to choose to look in the direction that has a nicer feeling associated with it. It doesn't take effort. It doesn't take willpower. It doesn't take self-improvement, because it's just common sense. And the more I began to look in that direction, the more safe I felt in the world. And I didn't really realize that I'd been living in the world feeling extremely unsafe. It wouldn't have been something that if you had asked me that I would have said, yeah, I'm living today feeling really unsafe. But when I look back now, I can see that my behavior reflected how unsafe I felt, how insecure I felt, how much I felt I needed to protect myself, how much I wasn't able to be committed to the relationship 100% because I needed to keep one foot out the door just in case, just in case things got bad, I'd need to have that exit route planned in some way. And in that inner safety, what it allowed me to do is actually finally get 2 feet in the relationship, to be fully committed. And this was after years of marriage. This is not something that came with marriage. This is something that came with realizing that I was the one losing out. I was the one not allowing myself to be vulnerable and open. And that with the commitment to the relationship also came the understanding of how to be in the relationship, because I wasn't looking at how to protect myself. I wasn't looking at what my best strategy was to not get my feelings hurt. I actually opened up my mind, and it was really humbling because, I hadn't seen how arrogant I had been. I hadn't seen how judgmental I had been. So it was very humbling on that level to sort of see myself more clearly. But in the seeing myself more honestly and more clearly, it allowed me to sort of realize I didn't need to do that anymore. And that I could be in life and the relationship in a way that had room for all of my experience without me having to change it and without me having to blame Angus for it. And to see that no matter what I felt, no matter what I thought, that there's a deeper place inside of me that's okay. And that was just life-changing. That was just so life-changing. And so I wanted to start with that because for me, this applies to everyone, every relationship. And it's not even about relationships. It's really about what's available inside of us. And as we experience that in whatever way we experience that, because it's very personal, there's no way to tell you how to do that, but we all know that place inside of ourselves in some way, that it's from that experience, an experiential knowing of that, and even just a tiny amount goes a long way to impacting every area of our life. And so really that's what I wanted to sort of start us off with in a really big picture general way, but also point to how practical it is on a very individual personal level, that it's profound and deep, but it's also ultimately very simple and practical.
Yeah. I like what you say, Harry, about, when you share this understanding. Well, I guess kind of how I was hearing it, when you share this understanding, you kind of learn real time. And for me, what's coming forward for me, when I listen to you share, is that, I feel like I'm going to share an experience that I've had, and I've shared this experience repeatedly within this format and other trainings that we've done. But I feel like I always see something new. And the new thing that I'm seeing today is that I feel like for many years, prior to this understanding was available to us, I think that the culture of our marriage was one of, let's fix it, let's get it, let's really work hard at it because it's really broken and it's really problematic. And there was probably a decade of that, which led up to this point where Rohini, started working with the Pranskys and had this insight where she really saw my psychological innocence. She suddenly turned up one day after a weekend up in the Pacific Northwest, and here I am ranting and raving. And in the face of that, what I was experiencing with Rohini was that, she was actually seeing me with eyes of compassion, which I had never seen before. And for all the work that we'd done in that culture of fixing our marriage over a decade plus, many years, where there were all these techniques, all these processes, all these seminars, all these, degrees that you could accumulate along the way, that were, you would think would lead us in that direction. None of that really held any water, but it was just this one single moment where I was ranting and raving and really kind of perplexed as to why she wasn't engaging in, meeting me where I was at, as it were. And I asked her, do you not have any comeback? And she said, no, I can see you're suffering with your thinking. And that could have been just some new psychobabble. It could be some term that, she'd learned that I probably don't need to, to take very seriously. But if it hadn't been for the fact that she looked at me with such authenticity when she shared that statement, we would have probably gone on our merry way and probably ended up separating. I don't know. But that was a pivotal moment. I could see she saw my psychological innocence. And even though at the time I may be not realizing what that meant, now I realize the full weight of what she was going through. And I think this is pivotal with this understanding. It's being able to see our partner, being able to see the people that we come into contact with in our daily lives. When they get caught up and when they get wrapped around the axle of their thinking, we see their psychological innocence and we can look at them with eyes of compassion. We don't have to take that personally. Sorry.
That's a huge thing too, though, seeing that in ourselves.
Yes.
Totally seeing it within ourselves.
It's almost easier to see it in other people.
Yes.
They're just innocently caught up in their thinking. Me, though, it's totally different. This is real.
Yeah, and Greg, thanks for saying that, because absolutely, for me, I think I needed to have that personal reference point, and I think that was pivotal for our relationship. But when I decided to take up the role of a transformational coach, then yes, absolutely, 100%, that's what occurred to me too. You start with yourself. You see the innocence in yourself. You see your own psychological innocence. You have compassion for yourself. And then that's the foundation, which makes it so much easier to see it in others. For
Right.
sure.
Mm.
That is definitely the starting point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because that's really
And
when the difference is made, because that's when you're carrying that true energy out with you into the world. When you see that true innocence and have that compassion for yourself, it just resonates, and everyone around you feels it. They can't help but resonate with that. Just like when, Angus, when you were in the midst of whatever you had going on in your head, and Rohini just looked at you with that compassion. And you, like you said, you could feel it. It wasn't just that she was saying words. There was something else behind it. And it was that she'd found that compassion for herself first.
Yeah.
Like Sid said, you can't give away something you don't have.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. And it is that there's a beautiful feeling that comes from that. I know I so vividly remember that experience. I'm sure I must have twitched, or there must have been some sort of glitch in the system. It's like, what is that? This is altogether new. And I couldn't understand it. But yeah, there's this really beautiful feeling that really comes with that compassion that, that obviously, we could also use that, the word of love would obviously spring to mind.
How do you guys see
authentic.
the eyes of compassion with the spiritual nature of the principles? What's the tie-in to that?
Well, I'll speak to my experience, and that compassion is a natural byproduct. For me, it was it wasn't something I was trying to do. It was just a natural byproduct of being more connected with that place inside of myself that's okay, that's well-being. Like, that was just what naturally came to mind. Whereas in the past, I would have been reactive and scared because I wasn't connected with that which is inside of myself. And my behavior would have reflected that. But having more of a connection with that deeper place inside of me, it just, Angus looked different, life looked different, but he in particular in that moment looked different to me. And I didn't see him anything other than, he's just really upset right now, he's not okay. It's not personal. Whereas I would have taken it very personally before.
In a way, it sounds like you were almost protected.
Yes, there was, yeah, in a sense, there was nothing I needed to be protected from in the way that I had felt previously. I needed to protect myself. Whereas in that moment, I felt completely safe because I was connected with that experience inside of me, where there is just ultimate feeling of okayness. And that's available to all of us. And I think that in from that place, we see that, like Angus is saying, we see the psychological innocence. I saw the innocence in his anger, but we see it, we can see that in ourselves and others. We see the wisdom that we're all doing the best that we can in every moment. And I think this is so key, especially when people are engaged in behaviors that they may have shame around or judgment around, but to see the wisdom and in the ways that we try to take care of ourselves. Like, in my judging Angus previously, in my criticism of him and my contempt, like, that was the best that I could do based on how it looked to me, like you're saying, Harry, in terms of taking care of myself. Like, I can see the innocence in that, and I can see the logic and why that made sense to me at the time. And I couldn't change that until I saw something different. I couldn't make myself behave differently. We tried, like Angus is saying, 10 years of different trainings and various things. But ultimately, it was when it genuinely looked different to me, the behavior changed itself. My behavior changed itself.
Or the behavior between you changed itself.
Yeah. Well, my behavior shifted, and then Angus was flummoxed, obviously, and his behavior shifted. You say it felt like a mirror. Sorry, I didn't turn my notifications off. I'm going to turn those off. But you said it felt like a mirror was being held up to you, even though I wasn't meaning to do that.
Yeah, no, I think, what occurs to me say now is that at the time I felt like on some level Rohini is home, and I'm somehow drifting out of orbit, being deprived of oxygen, and I need to get back to home base. I need to get back to the mothership. And what I mean by that was that I feel like, yes, absolutely, Rohini is in this place of genuine, authentic, loving, you know, and love and compassion. And I'm looking at myself, because the mirror is being held up to me, you know, to how I'm showing up. And I'm looking at myself and like, yeah, I'm being a total dickhead in this situation. This is really not who I am. This is not my authentic self. This is not my essential nature to be behaving this way. And Rohini feels like she's home. And I want to be there too. So it was like a glitch in the system. It was like, yeah, this was a moment that was really profound for me. Because in our 10 plus years of working really hard to save our relationship, nothing felt like it was going in the right direction until this one moment where she feels like, you know, she is in that place that feels like home, that feels like her higher self. And that's universal, you know, and really, I think really, if I'm to be genuinely honest about that experience, I think, you know, a lot of sadness came up for me at that point, because I was really realizing how far I was drifting away from my experience of that home base, our essential nature, our higher self. Not that we ever, you know, lose that, but we don't, you know, our ego will take us off on a tangent, and certainly, you know, that the tangent that I was on at that point was just, you know, experiencing my own level of personal suffering.
I want to emphasize to those who are here, what Rohini and Ross are talking about is they're not always on top of it.
You'll get it right at one point.
Maybe he'll get your names right eventually.
So they're not always on top of it. What is happening is when you have eyes of compassion or a feeling for what Rohini's talking about, the inside, you step into the uncomfortableness in a relaxed manner, knowing that it will evolve into a very positive feeling if you don't interfere with it with a lot of intellectual thinking. Mm-hmm. And that's a bit of a surprise, is that you're not always like know what is happening. In fact, quite often, I imagine Rohini feels quite confused by what Angus is thinking and feeling, type of thing. But it doesn't disturb her, because she knows that the spiritual nature, the principles are to evolve in a positive direction if we don't interfere with them.
Yeah, and I want to be clear that we're not, you know, that was a really defining moment in our relationship, and I'm not always seeing Angus with the eyes of compassion. But what happens now, because we know that's available, because I know that's available, when we start to get off track, we naturally, like you're saying, Harry, naturally course correct so much more quickly than we would have done in the past, because the feeling lets us know we're going in the wrong direction. We're heading somewhere there's going to be no win. And literally, when we get into it these days, it might, 10 minutes to turn something around versus 2 weeks or something previously.
Yeah, and I think another interesting thing is that now more often than not, if we piss each other off, so I hope I can use that term. You can bleep that
we're all
out.
adults here.
Is that we realize that that it's not something that we need to rush in and fix. So our intellect is going to yeah, let's figure this out. Yeah, there's a transgression here. We need to really look at this and let's process this situation. And now we're just like, oh yeah, they got caught up. Well, we know that we have a natural buoyancy that will take us back to our balance and harmony, to our well-being. And so we are much more inclined just to take our hands off the controls, let it be, leave it alone, and we'll find our way back. And we don't really need to have to figure that out.
Yeah, that's a big thing that changed for me was we're going to forget again. We're going to get caught up in the thinking. We're going to fall for the trap. The difference now is that I know that isn't my base. That's not my home. My home is one of peace and contentment. So when I'm feeling anything else, it's a temporary experience, and I will return home whenever I'm done with whatever it is I'm playing with. Whenever that toy gets boring, when I'm bored with that toy or I break it or something, I'll leave it alone and I'll come back. But until then, I'm going to play with it.
That's
But you notice it faster. and you notice that it's
Mhm.
not your home base, and that, and it takes the edge off. It makes it a little bit less serious, in my
Yeah.
experience. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm still kind of pissed off right now, but I
Mhm.
know that I won't be at some point.
Mhm.
Versus in the past, it was like, all right, I'm pissed now, and I'm always going to be.
Yeah.
Because, can you believe what that a-hole did to me? Can you
Mhm.
believe,
Mhm.
and now it's just totally different. It's completely backwards from that. It's like, all right, yeah, I fell for it. And then I laugh. And really 95% of the time it's done right then and there. I
Yeah.
see
Yeah.
it, I laugh, I move on. Sometimes my ego's a little more stubborn and caught up in it, and I hold on to it for a minute. I'm so
Yeah.
sure that I'm going to be right with this one at some point.
And there's a key point also, Greg, that you're saying, in that there's so much more lightness with being upset, is what I hear you saying. Like before, it would have been like a tragedy if Angus and I had a fight, or if he was upset with me, like it would have been a big deal and something I needed to look at and do something about. And now it's like, oh, not a big deal. Our relationship is not going to break. I'm not going to break from him being upset with me. He's not, it's like, it's all kind of shrinks down to size. So it's so much more manageable.
Right?
Don has a question,
Yes.
Greg.
Yeah, I was actually just about to get to her. You want to ask it yourself, Dawn? Or would you like me to ask it for you? Here, let me unmute you. There you
Yeah,
go.
no, thank you. Can you ask it for me? Because it would be better if you
All
did that.
Absolutely. All right, so what she typed in here is, do you have any thoughts about when or if a partner does not subscribe to things of a spiritual nature? So do you mean where you are growing and they are kind of staying where they were, type of thing? Is that what you mean by that?
Oh, she's typing. Maybe, where's the chat?
Well, just answer it from
Yeah,
what
I
you.
think I can speak to that in a more general way, and then if there's more specifics, Don, you can let us know, and you can add whatever makes sense. But I think that what ultimately this understanding is so practical and so fundamentally helpful in terms of just having more ease in life, that there doesn't have to be an overt spiritual flavor on it if somebody's not open to that. We've worked with atheists, we've worked with people that consider themselves scientific and not open to a spiritual orientation, and they've received tremendous benefit from this work. Angus and I personally do look very strongly in the spiritual direction, but that's that's personal to us, but we're not going to impose that on anyone else. And the other piece that I think is key, and when Angus and I had this shift in our relationship, Angus had no clue about what I was doing. He didn't want to even know what I was doing, what I was learning. I'd done so many various things in my educational process that he was just tired of what next bandwagon I was on. And so he didn't know anything about it. And yet our relationship changed. So it was through just one of us having me seeing something different allowed for our relationship to really become very different. And that was actually what had him become interested. So I don't think people need to have a very overt spiritual orientation. I don't think relationships need both people to learn about this understanding in order for it to function, the relationship to function well, because there's a natural ripple effect, like Harry was saying earlier. When I felt more connected with my own well-being and just more at home inside of myself, I showed up in the relationship differently. Me showing up in the relationship differently really was enough to impact Angus, and his behavior shifted. It drew out the best in him, whereas previously I was drawing out the worst in him. We were, on this downward spiral at times. So I firmly believe that even if he'd never learned anything about this understanding, our relationship would be transformed. And I've worked, with couples where only one person is interested and they've experienced shift in their own relationships. So I don't know if that covers exactly what your question was. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think there's the other thing that's that occurs to me around this is that when one party shows up from that place of compassion that we're pointing to, when one party shows up where then a place of complete non-judgment, that really they're trying to the best of their ability to take the high road in that sense. I think of the work that we've done even in when we work with companies and corporations, there are times where you maybe feel like you have to hold back, tone down the spiritual side of things, because in that setting sometimes that can be a little hard for them to hear. So we have to take it kind of slowly. So really we just talk about the role of thought. We talk about the state of mind. But as long as we hold that compass point, showing up, from a place of compassion, non-judgment, I think there's really something to be said that you kind of create this sort of like culture within that group, even in that moment, within that training, where people start to settle. It's like we're holding the bar at a certain level, and we stick to that level, and all boats kind of rise with the tide. It's really, we've seen that happen time and time again, and I think that happens in relationship for sure. Someone shows up in a place of compassion, non-judgment, and in a sense, the person who's kind of juxtaposed to that, the person who feels like they're polarized from that, actually will eventually start to be affected and impacted by it. So I think that I always feel that someone will get a jump, or jump in a level of understanding, awareness, and then I feel like there is that all boats rise with the tide feature, that the other person starts to settle, and when they settle, that the optics change, and hopefully those optics will start opening up the possibility for them. Maybe they don't even want to use the word spiritual, but ultimately that's what's going on, that's what's happening, for my money anyway.
Can I say something here? One of the interesting things with the question is, I don't know the Rosses that well, but I saw them originally in LA, and then a little bit, and what I've seen, just as some feedback, is how much, let's say Angus was a little bit more the rational person or whatever, is how much he softened over time. So it wasn't just that he had a experience with Rohini that really helped him. He continued to grow into that softness. So he embellished it. So the rational person may be a little slower, let's say, to jump in, but in Angus, in my opinion, you have changed a tremendous amount in softness. And of course, that's very appealing to someone like myself. Not that I'm trying to get a date with you or anything.
So I feel jealous.
I was waiting for my invitation. I was waiting for my invitation to the Mexican Riviera. No, but thank you. I feel like, part of that softening for me is really, now I get to a point where I get to observe where my ego starts to want to take over, where my ego can, have a kind of influence on the way that I show up that perhaps is not going to be very helpful to me, or is going to lead me hook, line, and sinker into suffering pretty quickly. So I think that for me, even in seeing that, I'm hopefully looking in a direction that's more humble, it's more universal in the way that, kind of we're all in this playing field together. We're all kind of one in it. And so for me, it's kind of like the more that I look in that direction, the more humility I have, and maybe that sort of shows up as hopefully a softening, and that's a term I actually embrace, and thank you for that. That would be a way I would love to be seen, for sure, because then I feel like my ego is less prevalent in the way that I show up in the world. Well,
continuing with that, maybe I can ask this question that This is a very sensitive question, and to be honest, a little bit too personal, but I'm hoping that you'll do it. It seems to fit in a little bit with what we're talking about. A lady client, she wanted me to ask you this question. When you have a good relationship with your spouse, how does understanding the three principles impact your intimate and sexual relationship with your partner? Pretty personal, to be honest. So, but I gave you a heads up.
I was trying to think of an amusing quip, but none came to mind. I thought there might be some sort of esoteric Sydney Banks book that, that we could share about, but no, I mean, I think that for sure, the intimacy, the sex life is really enhanced by the level of connection, the level of honesty. The way that we show up now in our relationship has taken away a great deal of tension that we formerly had, and as soon as that was taken off the table, the intimacy, which actually I would say fundamentally was quite challenged before we had this understanding, really that also found its balance and harmony, and that found its balance and harmony naturally, because we just, we weren't taking the conflicts. Suddenly we were looking at our conflicts in a whole different way. We were realizing that it was just, our suffering with our thinking, and then the connection kind of grew from there, from that point forward.
Yeah. Well, and I think that sexual intimacy is, like you said, Harry, it's sensitive, and it's one of the areas that gets impacted early on when there's any kind of resentment in a relationship. Angus and I experienced that. Many of the couples that we work with experience that. And I heard George on some podcast recently where he was saying that, couples will be able to build a bike together much more easily, even if they're not getting along well, but they're probably not going to be having sex together if they're not getting along well. So we can work as a team, as a couple, in lots of different ways. But if there's not a really good rapport and trust and closeness, then sex is usually out the window, or it's definitely suffering. And what this understanding, and I'll speak for myself, because I was probably the one that had the resistance versus you. But for me, what I really, again, coming back to that feeling of okayness, because I didn't have that previously, I had a lot of resentment toward Angus because, various things. And so with resentment, I didn't want to be physically intimate as often as he would have liked. I was much more reticent, and, the feelings that I was harboring got in the way of me wanting to have sexual intimacy. And so what this understanding did for me in this area is it helped me to realize that wasn't happening. My resentment wasn't coming from him. My resentment was me sort of going over and over the things that I was judging in him. So it was really a reaction to my own judgment and a harboring of my own judgment. And so I was living in the feeling of my own judgment. And that was what was getting in the way of me feeling close with him. And so when I got to see that more clearly and recognize that, like he was saying earlier, saw his psychological innocence, realized he's just doing the best that he can. I'm just doing the best that I can. What's there to be resentful over? When we're doing the best that we can, what's there really to harbor in resentment? And so all of that just came off my mind. Now, I wasn't expecting this. I wasn't looking for this. But with that off of my mind, all of a sudden, there's so much more willingness to enjoy the sexual part of our relationship. It was no longer something that I felt like I was having to do for him to make him happy. It was something that was mutually satisfying, as it had been earlier on in our relationship. But I had kind of put it down to, we've been together for 20 years or 15 years, however long it was. I'm older, I'm perimenopausal, sex drive is down. That's why, I'd made up all of these excuses as to why I should be satisfied with less satisfaction in that area. And I didn't realize that it was mostly pretty much resentment that I was harboring inside of myself that got in the way of enjoyment. And that, maybe there's some sort of different techniques that need to be used as we get older in life, but that wasn't the issue. That was not what the problem was. And I'm just so grateful that there's that level of safety and trust with us, that's something that I see as, continuing to grow and deepen and get better, and not something that is looking like, oh, as we get older, that's just going downhill and out the window. And I fundamentally attribute that to this understanding, because it freed me up from all of that noise. And just like being more intimate in an emotional way was a byproduct of that. Being more intimate in a physical way was a byproduct of that too. And again, the natural rapport between us in that area just naturally improved, because how can it feel to a partner if someone's kind of showing up a little begrudgingly in that area? It doesn't feel very good. And so to be able to just sort of have fun with it, be light in that area, not have it mean a lot, to just kind of, there's just a lot more lightness in every area, and that was an area where really that benefit from it. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, no complaints on my end. Just at nearly 60 years of age, I just like a little bit more agility, maybe.
Stop it.
For me, I'm talking about.
I don't know if the principles could help you with that. Probably can, though.
I don't know. I was hoping. I haven't seen anything in the fine print yet to see that the principles might help me there. I don't know.
While you were talking, I had an image, a story of mine come up. When I was very inexperienced sexually, I went to Denmark, and I happened to have an affair with an older woman. And the thing that she helped me the most with, and it really did change my life in that area, was no matter what I did, she was happy. There was no pressure. I was totally, and as soon as all that pressure was taken off, it didn't matter. Like it was a success no matter what. Mm-hmm. And I really think this woman was very wise in that area, because the more comfortable we are without pressure, obviously in anything, whether it's playing baseball or coaching or whatever, it's still just an activity. Mm-hmm. And if we have a lot of story around it and it's relaxing and calm with no pressure to perform, that's why the best 3P teachers are the ones who don't feel the pressure to perform.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It makes me think of the typing pool when it went from old-fashioned typewriters to word processors. I think the amount of mistakes dropped by 40%, something crazy, because they didn't have the same pressure because of spell check or whatever. Mm-hmm. But you're right, Harry. Yeah, you take away that pressure, and for me, yeah, you can say pressure, or I feel like, in our relationship, there was just this beautiful feeling that started to grow. And that's certainly, in terms of that, really helped our sex life enormously.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine it, you're investigating, because you're investigating all of life, and you're also investigating in that way as well. Mm-hmm. And why not?
Yeah, why not?
And why not?
We'll keep those investigations to ourselves, if you don't mind.
Yeah, that's yeah. I wonder if anyone else.
Angus is starting to get nervous about what story I'm going to bring up now.
Yeah, we don't need a play-by-play.
Anyone else has a personal question about anything like that? Is Greg still on here? I don't know if he.
Yes, he is. He's moved.
He looks.
Okay.
He's blushing. I think he's hiding under the table, actually.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Does anybody else have a question or comment? I just have people muted for background noise, so feel free to unmute yourself, or you can click the raise hand. Yeah, click raise hand in the participants tab, and that'll let me know that you want to get on too.
Hey, everybody.
Hi.
This is such a wonderful conversation. I'm finding lately that some of the people that I coach are slowly revealing that their significant other or their children or somebody they love is in an addictive situation. And I've told Rohini this before, that I felt that I need to refer them to someone who has skills dealing with addiction or codependency. But Rohini, you encouraged me to keep with the principles, and to, if I felt compelled to refer them, that's fine, but that I could still support them through the three principles, even if addiction is not my particular area of expertise. I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit. Because I noticed myself as a coach getting nervous, having thinking around, oh, I'm not an expert in that. I don't want to say something that might harm that part of their life.
Maybe I'll say something and then.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just as a tie-in, I have never been addicted, and primarily only worked with indigenous people until I was 69. And it was the area that I was hopeless in. And so when the level jumped, or I went inside to a deeper level, it was brought to me to work in this area. But it doesn't require me to know about all the things with addiction, because they'll teach you everything you need to know, just like in every other area. And I'm a little bit blessed because Greg is the subject matter expert, and so he's talking about something that I can't understand. So I don't go to where Greg is, because I can't talk about it in that deep a level as he is sharing it on. But I can share what I understand, and that is more than enough. It brings hope, feelings, and I'm like Rohini and Angus. I like to talk about the spiritual nature of I just like to talk about spirit, because of course I've taught a lot of indigenous people. It doesn't matter what subject it is. The principles cover everything. There is no, I'm amazed, people, supposedly I work in addiction, but most of the clients, it hardly comes up. It's about love and understanding, and just sharing what you know. No more. Sid was very big on that. Don't share more than you know. Share your insights and share what you know. And I guarantee you, in a very short period of time, you'll know more than most.
Thank you, Harry.
And I mean, I would agree with what Harry's saying. I think that the principles are an understanding that benefits every area of life, whether it's addiction, whether it's relationships, whether it's performance, because it's pointing to really having a deeper experience of your true nature. And anybody that is suffering in any way, that experience has wisdom in it, and they will learn what they need to learn from looking in that direction. And what happens is that people get scared, and they get consumed with trying to change things outside of themselves, especially with addiction. I think it can get very scary, depending on how, what serious symptoms there are associated with it, or life risks associated with it. And so it sometimes can be very hard to not look in the direction of the behavior, to not look in the direction of the suffering, to actually look to what's the direction of your deeper knowing, your wisdom. And so, like you said, Nish, as long as you feel open to looking in that direction with your clients and you feel comfortable with it, I think that it's a benefit to them. And especially to people that, like Harry was saying at the beginning of the call, people that are, in relationship or have children that are struggling with addiction. To me, this understanding is so profound, because the level of fear that can come up is tremendous, and the partner or the parent can feel so out of control. But when there's a deeper foundation with our own wisdom and our own well-being, there's less of a requirement on the other person to be different in order for us to be okay. And it doesn't mean that we don't set boundaries or whatever needs to be in place, but being able to be connected with that place of love and understanding inside of ourselves allows us to show up differently with a person who's struggling. And I remember a story about a man whose daughter was struggling with heroin addiction. She was a prostitute, and he just decided that he would have ice cream with her every week. He wasn't going to try and change her. He wasn't trying to do anything other than just be there and love her and accept exactly where she was at. And that was profoundly healing for her. And, you know, she ultimately did end up going into treatment, but there was no attachment to that on his part. And he couldn't have done it unless he had been connected with that love inside of himself.
Right.
And they're not broken, you know. They're just on the outside playing out their story or playing out the game of how they're dealing with stress. If you really talk to those people, if we want to use that as a quote rather than, they are very, very mystical, very, very spiritual. You learn a lot by being exposed to people who are going through so much suffering, because their only hope is in a spiritual reality. And so they have investigated life from a tough perspective. But God is not always about easy love. It's sometimes about tough love too. And they have much to share with you, much. They are sensationally
succulent? You like that word, succulent. you use that word often. So is that what you're looking for?
Why?
He's destroying. Our dog sounds like he's destroying the house. So I'm just going to get him for 2 seconds.
But for me, in my experience working with people with addiction issues, the biggest breakthroughs that people have had did not come from talking about addiction. It came from talking about what we talk about every time we have one of these. You know, we've gone through this whole session today without really mentioning addiction very much, but we're still talking about addiction. We're talking about addiction to another person. When you talk about relationships, codependency is a very common addiction that the vast majority of people have experienced at some point. So there's no difference between that kind of addiction and an addiction to a substance. It's still an innocent attempt to feel better, is really all it comes down to. It's an escape from whatever feelings we don't like. And people who turn to chemicals tend to be more sensitive people. It's harder for them to deal with the normal ups and downs of life. So just dealing with that part of it corrects the other part. Don't look at the symptoms. You can't cure the disease by looking at the symptoms, even though there's no disease. But you can't do it by looking at the symptoms. You have to get to the core cause. And the core cause is a disconnect from our true nature.
Right.
And you know about that. You know that very well. And you can share that very effectively. Because you, just like everybody else, you have access to the wisdom of the ages at every moment. And just being present with that person will have things come to your mind that you had never thought of saying before. And I catch myself doing that too. I'll say something to a client and go, wow, that's pretty profound. Like I should write that down. Like, what are they? You know, it's amazing how it comes out once you start sharing. And once you build that rapport, you know, because that's really the key to any kind of, you know, coaching or counseling is building a rapport with the person. If they don't trust you and they don't feel comfortable with you, they're not going to open up and nothing's going to happen. But once you establish that and you get that connection with them, it flows. And you'll know what to say.
Thank you.
I think Angus has something to,
No, I'm sorry. I missed I caught the gist of that. I was just after my dog wrangling experience. But yeah, I found there's been enormous leverage just by pointing to, you know, people's essential nature, one of innate well-being, you know, having a conversation about that. And then you know, in terms of the, you know, the addiction piece is like, that's just, yeah, they once they see the illusionary nature of thought and see that, you know, they're just trying to self-soothe the thinking that they're terrified of, and realize that, you know, home is their essential nature, their higher selves, and they have innate well-being. That conversation is just so exciting and beautiful. And, you know, when people have an insight around that, that seems to be the point of leverage. And yeah, absolutely, Greg, I agree with you. You just show up from a place of love and compassion and understanding, and you see their human spirit. You know, it's so much easier to have that conversation. And I love seeing, you know, when people get that, when they see, yeah, you know, I'm terrified of my thinking, and really it's all an illusion. You know, and behind it all, I have my essential nature, my well-being, my innate well-being. And I think, you know, we can, you know, we can all have that conversation. It comes very naturally, I think.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for asking.
And also, please listen to Sid Banks's talk on thought and alcoholism. You will see the simplest of answers to what is the pure cure for addiction or alcoholism.
That's on YouTube. Just look up Sydney Banks thought and alcoholism. It'll come up. Is that on our channel too, Harry?
I have it both. It's on our channel, and I also have it as a podcast. So it's either or. On our channel, or you can just go to where our podcasts are, and it's there as well. And we had about 1,800 people view it, so listen to it so far, and that alone makes me feel good. And what struck me about the talk, now this was, I believe, before Sid was trying to instruct the psychologist how they should approach the topic. So how he might answer it might be a little bit different in his later life. But he primarily, and I was a little bit thrown back, how simple he was saying, just change thought. And that's what he talked about. And that was basically it, change thought. But of course, he wasn't talking about intellectual thought. He was talking about what you guys are pointing to, inside out change thought.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah. And you mentioned that it's practical. Well, when I listened to Sid, I like his spiritual stuff. And of course, that's how I was trained, just like Chip and Elsie were trained that way. But I was surprised at how practical he made this, this talk. It was a very, very practical, simple talk. And it's interesting, because both of you are emphasizing how practical the three principles are in relationship and everything else.
Yeah, I think that people can sometimes think that something that's spiritual is just esoteric and not really related to, you know, day-to-day life. But this is an understanding that is so fundamentally impactful in, you know, living life, which I love that. But it comes through looking in a different direction than most people are used to looking in. It's not through looking at how to fix what's happening in life. It's through looking to the formless essence, to who we are. And then life seems to have a way of working itself out. Not, you know, necessarily how we're choosing for it to, but it kind of has its own course. And oftentimes it's far beyond what we would have even imagined for ourselves.
Well, do we have one last question before we wrap it up, or one final comment?
Is there a question in the chat?
I'm not sure. I'm not looking at the chat.
There's some thank yous.
Yeah.
Well, then it seems like this is a good place for us to say goodnight. But thank you so much, guys. Very,
thank
very
Thank you,
you.
Harry.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
And
Thanks for
thank you,
having
Greg,
us.
too.
Yeah,
This was so
thanks for
good.
joining us today. This was awesome.
Yeah.
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 Nice
thanks for
meeting you,
keeping it
Greg and
simple.
Harry.
Same here. Thanks for joining us. This was awesome.
Appreciate it. Take care.
Take care,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Thank